The jar slipped from Maren Sloane's hand and struck the plank floor with a thin crack, sending a white ribbon of milk across the hem of her dress, just as her baby began to cry. Every head in Pike's mercantile turned. Maren stood still for one beat too long, pearl hot and squirming against her shoulder, the smell of souring milk rising between boots and flour sacks. She had 1 coin left in her palm, not enough for another jar, not enough for lamp oil, not enough for much of anything except the shame now climbing her throat, while Mrs. Bellamy by the seed bins made a soft sound that was almost pity and mostly satisfaction. "I'll pay for it next week," Maren said. Harlan Pike stayed behind his counter with his thumbs in his vest, polite as frost. "Mrs. Sloane, you said that last week." Pearl's crying sharpened. Maren shifted her, bouncing once, her face set in that careful way a person held a door shut with a single hand when the wind was pushing from the other side. Mrs. Bellamy leaned nearer and whispered, not quite low enough, "She ought to go back to her husband's people." Maren looked down at the spilled milk shining on the boards and let out a tired breath that seemed to come from somewhere older than her years. "No one wants a widow with a baby," she said. A chair scraped at the back stove. The man who rose from it had been half hidden behind a coil of rope and 2 sacks of feed. He was broad through the shoulders, winter brown from sun and trail, with the kind of stillness that made other men look as though they were always fidgeting. He set down his coffee cup, crossed the room, and laid 2 coins on Pike's counter. Then he looked at Maren, not at the mess on the floor, not at the child, and said, "If it's a name you're short on, ma'am, you may borrow mine." The room went so quiet that Pearl's hitching breaths sounded loud as a saw. Pike blinked first. Mrs. Bellamy's mouth opened, then held there. Maren stared at the stranger as if he had spoken in some language known only on cattle drives and in fever dreams. He lifted one shoulder. Galen Boone. That was worse, in a way, because she knew the name. Everybody in Willow Bend knew it. Galen Boone had ridden trail north and south from the Powder River clear to Colorado. He broke horses without breaking their spirit, brought freight through spring mud when other teams turned back, and had the inconvenient reputation of meaning what he said. Men who lied for pastime disliked him. Men who paid their debts trusted him. Women said he was decent, which in that town had less to do with gentleness than with whether a man could be left alone with the till and come away lighter only by the dust on his sleeves. Maren tightened her hold on Pearl. "That is not a funny thing to say in a store. I wasn't trying to be funny." Pike cleared his throat. "Boone, best mind your business." Galen did not look at him. "I am." Maren felt every eye in the room waiting for her to blush, or rage, or break. She did none of the 3. She bent instead, awkward with the baby on one arm, and reached for the shards of the jar. Galen crouched before she could. His hands were scarred and square, moving carefully among the white glass. "Leave it," he said. "I don't leave my messes for other people." Something changed in his face then. Not a smile exactly, more like recognition. He gathered the pieces, rose, and set them by the stove. "I'm not asking for an answer in front of half the county," he said. "But if a lawful name would keep folks from handling your life like auction goods, the offer stands till sundown." That was when the bell over the door gave a hard jolt and Judd Sloane came in out of the wind. He looked enough like Maren's dead husband to strike old hurt before sense caught up. The same height, the same pale eyes, the same narrow bridge of nose. But where Noah had always seemed as though he were listening to some private sorrow, Judd wore his face like a tool meant for leverage. He took in the room, the milk on the floor, Galen Boone standing too close to his sister-in-law, and a little mean light entered his expression. "Well," he said, "this saves me a walk." He held out a folded sheet, already opened once and smoothed again. "Probate notice. Judge Talbot sits Friday morning." Since Noah left no clear provision beyond the mule team and the unfinished claim, the court will hear on guardianship of the child and management of assets. Maren did not take the paper at first. "What guardianship?" Judd's voice stayed even, almost weary. "You've no steady income, no property in your own right, and a nursing infant. The court can't leave a claim hanging on a woman who may not keep herself housed by Christmas." Pearl gave a soft, fretful cry, as if some part of her understood her name was being discussed by men who had not earned the right. Maren took the notice then, read the lines once, and felt the store tilt slightly around her. Not because she could not understand the words. Because she could. "Your concern is touching," she said. particularly after 6 months without a single visit. Judd's jaw flexed. My concern is for Noah's blood. Pike had the good sense to busy himself with the till, though he missed nothing. Mrs. Bellamy pretended to compare sugar prices. The whole town had suddenly found its afternoon. Galen's voice came low and flat. A man after blood usually starts with the child, not the acreage. Judd turned. This is family business. That little girl becomes family business for any man watching two jackals sniff around her cradle. Maren looked from one to the other, heart striking hard. She hated that Galen Boone's words gave shape to what she had not let herself name. Noah's claim lay along the creek east of town, 40 scrubby acres with a good spring at the north edge. Noah had said a man could make a living on less if he kept his back bent and his hopes modest. She had believed him. After he died beneath an overturned freight wagon in the March thaw, Judd had begun circling that land before the grave dirt settled. Now the paper in her hand made plain what circling meant. Friday, 3 days. When she lifted her eyes, Galen's were waiting. Steady, no pressure in them. Only the maddening fact of a door she had not imagined open an hour ago. If you want my name, he said quietly, you may have it before the judge sits. Judd gave a harsh little laugh. You mean to wed her for pity? Galen finally looked at him. No, I mean to wed her for purpose. Pity is a weaker thing. Maren left the store with the milk paid for, the notice in her pocket, and a town's worth of whispering at her back. By dusk, Willow Bend already knew. Anyone who had ever lived within reach of one church bell and 3 porches full of opinion would have known what came next. By supper, the barber had heard she trapped Galen Boone outright. By lamplighting, Mrs. Bellamy swore he had courted her in secret since spring. By full dark, boys running errands were snickering that Boone had bought a ready-made family at Pike's for the price of a milk jar. Small towns did not need facts when they had imagination and a long evening. Maren rented a single room above Verity Kells's boarding house, where the wallpaper peeled in one corner and the stove smoked when the wind came from the north. She climbed the back stair with Pearl asleep against her collarbone and sat on the bed without striking the lamp. The room smelled of starch, old pine, and the faint sweetness of the baby's hair. She did not cry. She had done enough of that in March, and grief had left her with no illusions about what tears could mend. Instead, she read the probate notice again. Management of assets. Guardianship of the child. Words written cleanly enough to make theft seem lawful. On the washstand sat Noah's pocket watch, stopped the day they pulled him from the creek road. Beside it lay her sewing shears, 3 cloth diapers waiting for mending, and the grocery sack with the new milk jar wrapped in paper. A life could look very small laid out on a washstand. She unlaced her boots, fed Pearl, and then, because there was no one to perform strength for in the dark, let her forehead rest on the baby's blanket. A knock came at the door. Verity Kells entered without waiting long enough to be refused. She was a lean woman in her 40s with sleeves always rolled and hair pinned with the severe efficiency of somebody who had outlived softness but not mercy. She carried a plate of beans and cornbread. You didn't come down, she said. I wasn't hungry. That's never once stopped a nursing child from requiring a mother who eats. Maren took the plate. Thank you. Verity stood by the door a moment. Is it true? Maren almost laughed. In this town, I'd need a better question. Did Galen Boone offer marriage? He offered his name. And I did not throw him out the window, mostly because this room has none large enough. Verity's mouth twitched despite herself. Then she sobered. Boone is a decent man, which doesn't make him a simple one. No, he keeps a place west of town. 2 rooms, a kitchen, Goodwell. Bought the use of it from Alma Rusk after her sons died off in Nevada. He's trying to turn enough profit from horses and freight to purchase it proper before spring. Maren looked up. Why are you telling me that? Because a man may offer kindness and still mean business with it. Verity folded her arms. And because if Judd Sloane takes that child to his sister's place outside Casper, you may never get her back without spending the rest of your life begging signatures from men. The words hung between them, rough and true. Would you do it? Verity asked. Maren stared at the beans cooling in her lap. She thought of Noah, whose hands had always smelled of harness leather and river mud. She thought of the church women who had stopped calling after Easter. She thought of Pike's polite voice and Judd's clean folded paper. I buried one husband, she said. That seems enough for any woman. Verity did not soften. This wouldn't be burial. It would be weather. Some weather is best waited out under a borrowed roof. After she left, Maren fed Pearl again and sat with the baby in the crook of her arm while whined worried at the eaves. Noah had been a good man in the ways that mattered and a hopeful one in the ways that ruined him. He had believed if he worked hard enough, folks would deal squarely. He had believed blood would keep blood honest. He had believed spring ice could hold one more wagon crossing if the horses were urged gently and God was willing. The wagon went through at the left wheel and took him with it. A good man, yes. But dead men left women to negotiate with the living, and the living rarely honored hope. By dawn, Maren had made up her mind. Not because she loved Galen Boone. She did not know enough of the man to love him. Not because she was defeated. Pride still sat upright in her bones. She did it because Pearl was asleep with one small fist open against her own breast, and Maren understood at last that pride made a poor roof for a child. She found Galen in the livery yard behind Hobbs' blacksmith shop, tightening a cinch on a roan gelding. Morning had come bright and hard, with frost-crusted white along fence rails. The horse blew steam. Hammers rang from the smithy in dull iron bursts. Galen glanced up when her shadow crossed the packed ground. He did not look surprised, which annoyed her for reasons she could not quite sort. "I have terms," she said. He straightened slowly. "That sounds promising." Pearl was bundled thick against the cold, blinking solemnly from her blanket nest. Galen's gaze dropped to the baby with an odd carefulness, as if children were creatures best approached by men who knew the worth of not crowding them. Maren kept her chin high. "Separate rooms." "Agreed." "My sewing money stays mine." "Agreed." "I will not have you buying authority over my child because the law gives you an opening." His answer came quick. "I wouldn't. If this arrangement sours, I leave with Pearl." "Yes." She studied him. "You ought to have asked what you receive in return." At that, he rubbed a thumb over the leather strap in his hand, thinking, "A house is quieter than I care for. Folks stop treating me like I'm one gust away from saddling up. Pike quits hinting that a solitary man is a bad risk. And if it helps at all, Alma Rusk will stop saying a place only becomes a home when there's someone inside who remembers to bank the stove at night." That startled a laugh from her before she could stop it. It lasted no more than a breath, but it changed the morning. "You are serious," she said. "I was serious in the store." "Why?" The yard noises carried on around them. Forge, hoof scrape, a teamster cursing a balky mule. Galen seemed to choose his words from a shelf that held fewer than most men's and better ones. "Because I know what it costs when the world decides a child is a burden before she can speak," he said. "And because I have a name that's done me good. Seems stingy not to put it to work." Maren did not ask what he meant. Not yet. Some truths announce themselves best when not chased. "Then let's do it before I come to my senses," she said. Judge Talbot married them in his office between a land dispute and a drunk hauled in for sleeping under the church wagon. Verity Kells stood witness for Maren. Hob the blacksmith stood for Galen, smelling of soot and hot iron. There were no flowers, no ring beyond the plain gold band Galen borrowed from his mother's cousin in the next street. No vows beyond those required to satisfy a territory that trusted paper more than character. When the judge pronounced them man and wife, Galen did not reach for her. Maren was grateful for that. She had enough strangeness in her body already. But when they stepped outside and the noon bell rang from the schoolhouse, Willow Bend saw them come down the steps together. Maren Sloane no longer Sloane by law, Pearl bundled between them, and Galen Boone carrying the satchel with her sewing things as if it had always belonged in his hand. By evening she stood in the yard of his place west of town, looking at a house the color of old wheat with a sloping porch and two cottonwoods standing sentry by the well. Beyond it stretched a patchwork of rough pasture, split-rail fence, a small barn listing slightly to the north, and farther out the sage country turning silver toward dusk. It was not grand. It was not even easy-looking, but the place felt used in honest ways. A shovel leaned by the step. Split kindling sat stacked and covered. Smoke rose straight from the chimney. "Kitchen's warm," Galen said. "Room on the right is yours." "Mine's left." Maren shifted Pearl and walked up the steps without thanking him, not because she was ungrateful, but because gratitude felt too close to surrender, and she was not there yet. Inside, the floors were scrubbed, the table scarred and solid, the curtains plain. Someone had set fresh water in the wash basin of her room and laid 2 folded quilts at the foot of the narrow bed. On the windowsill stood a chipped blue crock holding late asters gone dry around the edges. She turned, surprised. Galen, still in the doorway, looked almost embarrassed. "Alma Rusk brought those," said a woman ought not arrive to bare boards if it could be helped. That first week passed like learning to hitch unfamiliar horses, cautious, awkward, full of moments where one wrong tug might start trouble. Maren woke before dawn to feed Pearl and found coffee already warming on the stove. Galen came in from the barn smelling of hay and cold air. He spoke when speaking was useful, left silence alone when it was not, and never once stepped into her room without knocking against the jamb first. In the evenings he mended tack by lamplight while Maren sewed shirts for miners at the creek camp, and Pearl slept in a basket pulled near the stove where both could hear her stir. The town did not reward decency with quiet. Mrs. Bellamy told anyone listening that no respectable man wed that fast unless there had been cause. Pike, smiling as ever, asked after Galen's finances in tones smooth as cream. Judd appeared at the judge's hearing Friday with trimmed whiskers and his best coat, arguing that a hasty marriage made no proper safeguard for an infant's inheritance. Maren answered for herself. She stood in Judge Talbot's office with Pearl on her hip and the marriage certificate in her hand, and said, "The land was my husband's wish for his daughter. I will work it or lease it, but I will not have it transferred to a man who ignored her till there was water under the deed." Judge Talbot, who had daughters of his own and a face shaped by years of hearing lies, peered over his spectacles at Judd. "Mr. Boone." Galen shifted his hat in his hands. "The child stays with her mother. My household is sufficient. My accounts are current. If the court wants references, it may take half the county, though I prefer not to inconvenience that many liars at once." That won the first sound close to laughter the judge had made all morning. Temporary guardianship remained with Maren. Management of the claim was continued for 30 days until Noah's accounts could be reviewed. It was not a full victory, but it was a stay against being stripped. For the moment, that was enough. Afterward, as they stepped from the office into brittle October sunlight, Galen paused on the boardwalk. "You did well in there," he said. "So did you." He scratched lightly at the back of his neck. "I've had practice with men who mistake quiet for weakness. And do they usually keep the error long? Not if they're observant." It was the nearest thing to teasing she had heard from him, and it sat surprisingly easy between them. The days settled into a pattern. Maren took in sewing, kept the house, and began going through Noah's old ledgers at the kitchen table after supper, not because she enjoyed figures, but because figures had started reaching for her child, and she meant to know their names. Galen worked horses for neighboring ranchers, hauled freight twice a month, and repaired Alma Rusk's wind-bent fence in exchange for reduction on the purchase price of the place. That was how Maren learned the house was not merely rented. Galen meant to buy it outright by spring. "You could have told me," she said one evening. He was shaving curls from a wagon spoke with his pocket knife. "You could have asked, 'Did you marry me to improve your standing with Pike?'" No, his knife stopped. But it doesn't hurt with men who trust rings more than records. Convenient. He met her gaze over the table. Useful. Not the same thing. She wanted to resent how fair that was. A week later, Rosario Arriaga came calling with a bundle of hems and an energy that reached a room before her boots did. She was young only by comparison to grief, with thick black hair pinned high and measuring tape looped around her neck like a badge. Her father ran the wagon repair shed south of town. Rosario ran everything else she could get her hands on. "I heard you do fine handwork," she said to Maren after the shortest possible greeting. "And I heard you can keep a ledger without crying over it, which makes you a rare jewel among the people I know. I have orders from the camp upriver and more shirts than one pair of hands should tackle. If we work together, I can raise my prices and stop being spoken to like a girl with pins in her mouth." Maren glanced at Galen, who was feeding kindling to the stove and pretending not to enjoy himself. "I'm newly married," Maren said dryly. "That seems to make everybody believe I am free for all kinds of business." Rosario grinned. "Good. Then say yes to mine. I don't require romance, only buttonholes." Rosario's motive was plain as sunlight. She meant to build something of her own and would use every honest, capable woman within 10 miles to do it. Maren liked her at once for that. By the end of November, a second table had been set near the window for cutting cloth. Pearl learned to watch needles flash and cloth fold while the women worked. Rosario talked enough for two and listened hard beneath it. From her Maren learned whose wheat had failed, whose son had gone east, which cattle buyer cheated by shaving weights, and how often Harlan Pike's name surfaced in stories where land passed from tired hands into his without anybody quite understanding how the figures turned. Men like him never steal in chunks, Rosario said, biting thread. They shave a little from every honest person till the whole town looks poorly and he alone looks prospered. Maren remembered Noah's ledgers then and went back to them that night with a sharpened pencil and a colder eye. It was in the false bottom of Noah's harness chest that she found the letter. The discovery came because Pearl had pushed one stocking foot against the sideboard while Maren was lifting out the last of Noah's winter tack to air for mildew. The plank shifted under her hand. Beneath it lay a flat packet wrapped in oilcloth, one folded letter, one stamped receipt from the Territorial Land Office, and a bank draft canceled 3 days before Noah died. Maren sat right down on the floor. The receipt showed final payment lodged against the creek parcel. The draft matched almost exactly the amount Pike had claimed remained unpaid. Her fingers trembled only once, and then she forced them still before opening the letter. Maren, if this reaches you because I cannot explain it myself, then things have gone worse than I meant. I paid Pike at the bank for the land and took his word the note would be cleared. 2 weeks later he spoke as though there were still money due and smiled when he said perhaps I had misremembered. I no longer think it an error. I have put Pearl's name in the filing where I could, because a man may be bullied easier than a child on paper. Do not trust Judd in this. He asked after the spring twice in 1 week and not once after you. If anything happens, take these to the judge, not to Pike. I am sorry for leaving more weight than comfort. Noah. Maren read it 3 times, and by the third the words blurred, not from tears exactly but from the kind of hurt that came when the dead reached across time to prove they had seen the danger and failed to stop it. Noah had not been careless. He had been trapped. Worse than that, he had known enough to be afraid and had still gone alone. When Galen came in, stamping snow from his boots, he found Maren sitting on the floor beside the open chest, Pearl asleep against her lap, Noah's letter spread over her skirts. He did not ask what was wrong. He knelt first, because upright sympathy from standing men had never done much good for anyone. She handed him the letter. He read it without hurry. His face changed very little, but the little mattered. So Pike means to claim a debt already paid, he said. And Judd means to help him. Yes. Maren let out a breath that shook at the end. I have spent 8 months wondering whether Noah knew what sort of danger he left us in. Now it seems he did, and he tried, and he still died in that road thaw like a fool because he thought paper and truth were cousins. Galen folded the letter carefully. Truth has poor relations in a lot of counties. She laughed once, a broken sound, and to her own surprise it tipped into weeping before she could stop it. Not violent, not pretty. Just the body's long-postponed surrender to the fact that grief had changed shape but not weight. Galen did not move toward her until she leaned first. Then he set one hand between her shoulder blades, solid and warm, and let her cry with the simple courtesy of not turning it into an event. When at last she drew away, embarrassed, he looked at the sleeping baby rather than at her face. My mother had no husband's name when she came west, he said. The words were so unexpected that Maren stared. She worked in a hotel laundry outside Cheyenne. Folks decided what sort of woman she was before she finished introducing herself. Men took liberties. Women withheld kindness to prove they were better. I was old enough to know she went hungry so I could eat, and too young to help with more than wood and water. His mouth thinned slightly. A ranch cook named Boone let her use his name when fever took her. Not in marriage, just on the burial paper, so she wouldn't be lowered under the word unknown. I kept it when I was old enough. Built it till it could carry more than I had found it carrying. Maren said nothing for a moment. The room seemed smaller around that truth, and kinder for holding it. That is why you did it, she said at last. That is part of why. And the rest. He looked at her then, finally. The rest is your business, if you want it. After that night, something eased. Not all at once. Trust never entered a house by kicking the door open. It came like thaw water under a gate, quietly changing the ground before anyone named it. December brought harder cold. Pearl cut 2 teeth and ached through them with indignant determination. Galen proved better at walking a fretful baby by lamplight than Maren would have guessed from his size. He paced the kitchen in long, patient circles, one big hand cupped over Pearl's back while she fussed herself towards sleep against his shoulder. Once, half awake in her doorway, Maren saw him standing by the stove in his shirt sleeves, murmuring some trail song too low to catch, and the sight struck her with a force she did not welcome because it felt perilously like longing. Outside, trouble kept moving. Pike began sending notes regarding the uncleared balance on Noah's claim. Judd stopped pretending concern and started measuring distances with his eyes, as if he already owned what lay between fences. Judge Talbot set a final hearing for the second week of January and advised Maren to bring any documentary proof she had, though his tone said proof alone did not always defeat money. Rosario, hearing the matter in full, slapped both palms on Maren's table. If Pike altered the account books, he did it in more than one place, she said. Men like that worship habit. We need his own figures against him. How? Galen asked. Rosario smiled a dangerous smile. By letting him believe ladies come to the bank only for alms and gossip. 3 days later, she walked into Pike's office with an invoice from the wagon shed and a head full of honeyed complaints about her father's slowness to sign the necessary credit forms. While Pike hunted for the ledger to prove his own importance, Rosario watched where he set other books, which drawers stuck, and which shelf held receipts rather than promissory notes. She came out with no stolen paper, but enough knowledge for Maren to know where lies preferred to live. Verity Kells contributed next. She remembered Noah coming down from Pike's bank the day mentioned on the draft, pale and angry, stopping at the boarding house table long enough to ask for ink and write something before folding it into his coat. Tamsin Brewster, the town's midwife, remembered treating the bruises on Noah's ribs after the wagon accident and remarking that a river road did not usually leave marks shaped like a man's boot. That knowledge sat like a stone between them. You think he was beaten? Maren asked. Tamsin's lined face hardened. I think a man who had become inconvenient may have been discouraged from talking. I cannot prove more. No one said the rest aloud. In Willow Bend, accusation without proof only fed the accused. Then, on a night so cold the window glass showed fern white with frost, the danger came straight to the house. Pearl woke, crying a little after midnight. Maren rose, wrapped her shawl close, and had just lifted the baby when the yard dogs began a raw barking fit from Alma Rusk's adjoining pasture. Galen was out of bed at once. She heard the floorboards answer his stride, heard the back door open, then the short, hard shout of a man spotting what should not be there. By the time Maren reached the kitchen, Pearl clutched to her breast, smoke already licked under the door from the barn's side. Stay inside, Galen shouted. A lantern had been thrown or dropped. Later they would never settle which. Dry hay took to fire with the greed of a year's waiting. Flames raced the barn wall, orange against the black. The mare in the nearest stall screamed and kicked. Galen vanished into the smoke. Maren set Pearl in her basket on the kitchen table, wrapped her in quilts, and ran for the chest where Noah's papers lay. Not because documents mattered more than flesh. Because the flesh she loved would lose its future without them. The house had not yet caught, but heat rolled across the yard in fierce breaths. She snatched the oilcloth packet, shoved it under her dress against her stays, and rushed back to the kitchen just as the outer door burst open and Galen half-carried, half-dragged the roan gelding clear of the barn. The horse hit the yard wild-eyed. Sparks blew like red bees. Get to Alma's, he called. Maren seized Pearl's basket. Then she saw it. The second horse stall, the old bay mare Noah had broken before Pearl was born, stamping in panic against a jammed latch. No, she whispered. Galen was already turning back, but a beam cracked and fell across the doorway in a bloom of sparks. Maren thrust the basket at him. Take her. Before he could stop her, she ran. Heat slapped the breath from her. Smoke clawed her eyes. The mare threw herself against the boards again, and Maren reached through flying cinders to wrench the latch pin free with both hands. It stuck. She braced a boot, pulled till the iron tore skin from her palm, and the bar came loose all at once. The mare lunged past her, flank striking her shoulder hard enough to send her into the wall. Then a hand closed around her arm. Galen. He hauled her toward the opening as part of the roof came down behind them in a roar that changed the dark. They hit the yard together, coughing. Maren fell to one knee. Galen still held Pearl's basket in his other arm, though she could not say later how he had managed both. Neighbors were coming now, lanterns, buckets, shouted names. Rosario arrived with her father's wagon team before the flames had half spent themselves. Hob the smith and 3 ranch hands formed a line from the well. Snow glittered underfoot, turning black where cinders landed. From the road, Harlan Pike watched with his collar up and sorrow arranged neatly on his face. Maren saw him. Saw, too, how little surprise lived there. By dawn the barn was half charred. The hay gone, one wall of the shed collapsed. The house still stood. So did the well, the fence, the mare, the child, the papers beneath Maren's dress now damp with sweat and smoke. Galen's forearm had blistered where fire kissed through his sleeve. Maren's palm was torn open. They sat at the kitchen table while Tamsin wrapped them both, the room smelling of singed wool and boiled bandages. "You are both fools," Tamsin said, which was her version of relief. Rosario stood at the window like a sentry. Pike was on the road too fast for a man roused honest from sleep. "No accusation we can prove," Galen said. "Then we prove the one we can," Maren answered. The hearing was the next morning. She did not sleep before it. Instead, she copied Noah's letter in her neatest hand in case the original went missing, then stitched the land receipt and draft into the batting seam of Pearl's blanket, where no searching man would think to look unless he had first learned how mothers stored their most precious things. At daylight, she put on her brown dress, the one with the least wear at the cuffs, braided her hair tight, and pinned Noah's watch inside her bodice. Galen came in from the pump with water frozen in his mustache and looked at her for a long second. "You don't have to go in there alone," he said. "I know." That was new, too. Knowing a thing and believing it were often different labors, but they had begun meeting each other. The courtroom in Willow Bend was no more than the meeting hall over the feed store, with a judge's desk at one end and benches varnished by the weight of other people's trouble. Yet that morning it felt grand enough to house the sorting of a life. Judd sat beside Pike in a coat too fine for his means. Pike's ledgers were stacked near his elbow. Judge Talbot entered, coughed once into his handkerchief, and called the matter of the Sloane claim and infant guardianship. Pike presented first, as creditor and advisor. He spoke smoothly of unpaid balances, irregular income, the peril of unfinished land left in inexperienced hands. Judd followed, grieving and duty-bound, ready to protect his brother's child, sorrowful that Maren's impulsive remarriage had clouded what ought to have been simple. Maren listened until the room felt airless. Then Judge Talbot turned to her. "Mrs. Boone." She rose with Pearl in her arms. The baby had outgrown one blanket corner and kicked it free while Maren stood. Something about that small, impatient movement steadied her better than any prayer. "My husband Noah Sloane paid the land balance before he died," she said. "Mr. Pike took his money and kept the debt alive on paper. I have the receipt. I have the draft. I have my husband's letter naming his fear of both Mr. Pike and Mr. Judd Sloane in this matter." A rustle moved through the benches. Pike's color changed by almost nothing. "A letter may be written by anyone. So may a ledger," Rosario said from the back. All heads turned. Judge Talbot frowned, but not enough to stop her. Rosario came forward with her father beside her and a bundle of account slips in hand. "My father's repair invoices have been entered twice at Pike's Bank these 3 months running, once in pencil and once in ink with a higher figure. Hobbs' freight note also. I have copies, because unlike some men I was taught numbers should agree with themselves." Hobb grunted assent from the second bench. Pike rose. "This is irregular. So is burning down a witness's barn the night before hearing." "Verity," Kells said coldly. Judge Talbot banged for order. The room settled badly. Maren bent, opened one seam of Pearl's blanket with the small scissors she had brought, and drew out the folded papers before anyone could decide to object. A murmur swept the hall. She handed them to the judge with a hand bandaged white at the palm. Talbot read the receipt first, then the draft, then Noah's letter. He asked Pike whether the signature on the bank instrument was his. Pike did not answer quickly enough. That was the moment the room turned. Not fully, not kindly. Towns never repented in a single breath. But the balance shifted enough for truth to find footing. Judd pushed to his feet, red-faced. Even if the balance was cleared, she entered a false marriage to secure the claim. Maren looked at him then. All the fear of the last months burned down to something cleaner. "No," she said. "I entered a lawful marriage to keep wolves from naming themselves shepherds." Silence followed. Then she added, Because there are hours when a life narrows to one sentence and a person either says the right one or loses it forever. A good name means nothing if it does not make room for the helpless. Nobody spoke over that. Not Pike. Not Judd. Not even Mrs. Bellamy in the back row with her lips already parting for later use. Judge Talbot removed his spectacles and polished them slowly, which in him was a sign of contained temper. "This court recognizes the claim as paid," he said at last. "Guardianship remains with the mother. Management of the parcel will vest in trust to the child under the mother's care, subject to no action by Mr. Judd Sloane absent further lawful petition." He turned to the deputy. "As to the bookkeeping irregularities and allegations of arson, the sheriff may take statements this afternoon. Mr. Pike, you will make your records available." Pike stood very still. Men like him did not rage when watched. They calcified. Judd's face had gone slack with the look of somebody who finally understood that the thing he had treated as available would remain forever out of reach. Outside, the crowd spilled onto the boardwalk in a low thrum of winter coats and muttering. Some offered Maren nods they had not offered before. She took none for friendship. Vindication arrived late and thin in most places. Galen came down the steps beside her carrying Pearl, who had fallen asleep in the middle of justice and missed the best part. For a few moments they stood in the cold without speech. Snow clouds had thinned. Sun touched the tops of the cottonwoods near the church, turning each bare branch bright as wire. "It's done," he said. "It is. You are free of the bargain, if you wish it. Once the papers are entered proper." He kept his eyes on the street as he said it. "I meant what I offered, not what I own." Maren had known this might come. All through the hearing, under the smoke smell still trapped in her hair, she had known it. A borrowed roof could become a cage if one stayed from gratitude rather than choosing. So she did what had frightened her more than widowhood, more than gossip, more than a courtroom full of men pretending fairness. She chose plainly. "Look at me, Galen." He did. "I married you for shelter," she said. "That is the truth. Then I stayed these weeks because you kept your word. Because you never once used my need as a handle. Because my child reaches for you when she hears your step." Her throat tightened, but she went on. "If I remain now, it will not be for safety alone." The winter air seemed to pause around them. Galen's expression did not break wide open the way a younger man's might have. He was not built for grand outwardness. But something deep in him eased, and Maren saw how long he had lived with restraint as his only respectable coat. "I'd be grateful for that," he said. She almost smiled. "That sounds poor enough for a declaration. It's the best one I've got on short notice." So she leaned forward, in full sight of Willow Bend and every porch it would later report to, and kissed his cheek with all the calm deliberation of signing a document meant to last. Rosario, watching from the hitch rail, hooped so loudly a passing team shied sideways. The rest came not like thunder, but like weather clearing one fence at a time. Pike's ledgers yielded uglier figures than even Rosario had predicted. He had been carrying paid balances, trimming amounts from widows and freighters, and using muddled notes to angle land toward foreclosure. The sheriff could not prove he ordered the barn fire, but the bookkeeping alone was enough to finish him in Willow Bend. Men withdrew their accounts. Alma Russ called in her small certificate. Hobb took his repair work elsewhere. By February, Pike sold the bank to a cousin out of Laramie and left town under the careful silence reserved for men nobody minded losing. Judd went east to relatives who, according to Verity, deserved him. The Creek parcel remained in Pearl's name. Since a nursing child could not exactly argue crop rotation, Maren leased the tillable strip to Alma Rusk for beans and kept the spring rights separate. Rosario convinced her to use part of the lease money to buy better thread, finer needles, and a second-hand treadle machine from a widow in South Pass who preferred company to commerce. By April, the room by the window had become a proper workspace where Maren and Rosario stitched shirts, mended coats, and cut sturdy dresses for women who had begun noticing that the quiet widow west of town knew how to make things last. Galen bought the house from Alma on terms now suddenly less difficult without Pike between them. He rebuilt the barn with Hobb and 2 ranch hands, set the posts deeper, and raised the roofline higher against drifting snow. When Pearl took her first steps in the yard mud between winter and spring, she did so with one hand reaching for Maren and the other flung boldly toward Galen, as if the whole business of choosing did not strike her as difficult at all. There were hard days still. Babies sickened. Orders ran late. A June hailstorm cut the kitchen garden to rags. One night Galen came home with blood on his shirt from a horse that had thrown him against a gate, and Maren sat up re-bandaging his ribs with a temper sharper than fear, because by then she had learned those two often wore the same coat. They quarreled once over whether the south pasture could support 2 borrowed mares through August, and once over whether Pearl ought to be weaned before the county fair. Marriage made room for tenderness, but it did not remove weather. It only meant weather had more than one pair of hands to meet it. By the second autumn, the town had grown used to speaking of the Boone place without any pause before the name. That mattered less to Maren than it once might have. She no longer flinched when introduced. She no longer counted every purchase against humiliation. She stood straighter at counters. Men addressed their invoices to Mrs. Boone and found, if they attempted condescension, that she corrected sums faster than they did. As for Galen, he laughed more. Not loudly, never for show. But Maren would hear it in the yard when Pearl trotted after chickens with absurd determination, or at the table when Rosario declared she intended to charge bachelors extra for missing buttons on principle. The house was no longer quiet in the way he had once meant. It was cluttered with thread spools, a tin pail of clothespins, child shoes abandoned in doorways, and the small daily noises that proved nobody inside was preparing to vanish. If this tale ever found company in a dim kitchen, a truck cab, or a lamplit room after a long day, perhaps that was why it settled kindly on the heart. Not because trouble had stayed away. Trouble rarely did. But because the old hunger to be chosen and the older duty to protect had met at one rough table and agreed to become a home. Years later, people would remember the winter Pike left and speak of ledgers and hearings and the barn fire as if those were the heart of it. They were wrong. The heart of it was quieter. It was in the sight of Maren on a late summer evening standing barefoot on the porch boards, one hand full of damp sheets for the line, the other braced at the small of her back, watching Galen come in from the lower pasture with Pearl asleep across his saddle in the fold of his arm. The sun lay low over the sage. Cottonwood leaves flickered silver-green in the yard, and when he lifted the child down and set her drowsy weight between them, there was no borrowed thing left in any of it at all.